June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 in the morning, the Soviet border near Brest-Litovsk. Private Ivan Morozov had been standing guard for 6 hours when the horizon exploded into fire. The ground shook beneath his boots. The sky turned orange, then red, then a blinding white. Artillery shells screamed overhead in numbers he couldn't count. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, raining down on positions his commanders had insisted were completely safe. Buildings that had stood for centuries disintegrated in seconds. Men who had been sleeping in their bunks were buried alive before they could even open their eyes. Ivan dove into a crater, pressing his face into the mud as the world ended around him. Through the chaos, through the deafening thunder of explosions, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Engines, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. He lifted his head just enough to see them coming through the smoke and fire. German tanks, wave after wave of them, stretching back to the horizon like an iron tide. Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs. They crushed everything in their path, fences, trenches, bodies. Behind them came the infantry, hundreds of thousands of soldiers in field gray, advancing in perfect formation. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and Ivan Morozov, like nearly 3 million other Soviet soldiers scattered along an 1,800-mile front, had received no warning, no orders to prepare, no indication that the most devastating military assault in human history was about to be unleashed upon them. What he didn't know, what almost no one on that border knew, was that dozens of spies, intelligence officers, diplomats, and even one German soldier who had literally swum across a river the night before had tried desperately to warn Joseph Stalin that this attack was coming. Stalin had ignored every single one of them, and 4 million Soviet soldiers would pay the price. If you're finding this story gripping, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you the untold stories behind history's greatest events, and your support helps us continue this work. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to understand how one man's stubborn refusal to listen to the truth led to one of the greatest catastrophes in military history. To understand what happened on that terrible June morning, we need to go back almost 2 years earlier to August of 1939, when Joseph Stalin made a decision that would shock the world. Hitler and Stalin were supposed to be mortal enemies. The Nazis had built their entire ideology around the destruction of communism. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf about his plans to conquer the Soviet Union and enslave its people. The very name Nazi came from the German words for National Socialist, but Hitler's version of socialism was violently opposed to the Marxist variety practiced in Moscow. Stalin knew all of this. He had read Mein Kampf. He understood Hitler's goals. And yet, on August 23, 1939, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signed a non-aggression pact that stunned observers on both sides. The two great totalitarian powers of Europe, powers that had spent years denouncing each other in the harshest possible terms, were now allies. The secret protocol attached to that pact divided Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split down the middle. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia would fall under Soviet influence. Finland and parts of Romania would also be absorbed into Moscow's sphere. For Stalin, this pact was a masterstroke of diplomacy. It bought him time. The Soviet military had been devastated by the Great Purge of 1937 and 1938, when Stalin had ordered the execution or imprisonment of over 50,000 military officers, including 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and 50 of 57 corps commanders. The Red Army was a shadow of its former self, led by inexperienced officers who had risen to their positions not through merit, but through survival. Stalin knew he needed years, maybe a decade, to rebuild. The pact with Hitler would give him that time. Germany would be busy conquering Western Europe while the Soviet Union recovered its strength. At least that was the plan. But what Stalin failed to understand was that Adolf Hitler had never stopped thinking of the Soviet Union as his ultimate prize. The pact was nothing more than a tactical convenience, a way to avoid a two-front war while Germany dealt with France and Britain. Once the West was subdued, Hitler would turn east. The question wasn't whether Germany would attack the Soviet Union. The question was when. By the summer of 1940, Hitler had conquered France in a stunning 6-week campaign that had shocked military experts around the world. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped destruction at Dunkirk. Britain stood alone, battered but unbroken, protected by the English Channel and the Royal Air Force. Hitler faced a choice. He could continue his assault on Britain, attempting an invasion across the Channel, or he could turn his attention to the real prize, the vast territories of the Soviet Union, with their limitless resources, their wheat fields, and their oil. On July 31st, 1940, Hitler summoned his generals to a meeting at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. The view from the terrace was spectacular, snow-capped peaks stretching to the horizon, eagles circling in the crystal-clear air. But Hitler wasn't interested in the scenery. He had made his decision. Russia's destruction must be made a part of this struggle, he told his assembled commanders. If we smash Russia, Britain's last hope will be gone. The master of Europe and the Balkans will then be Germany. The operation would begin the following spring. It would be called Barbarossa, after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had led the Third Crusade in the 12th century, and it would be the largest military operation in human history. But Hitler's decision to attack was not made in a vacuum. The Soviet intelligence apparatus, one of the most extensive spy networks the world had ever seen, was already picking up the first hints of what was coming. In Tokyo, a German journalist named Richard Sorge was hosting dinner parties at the German embassy, charming Ambassador Eugen Ott and his staff, while secretly reporting every word they said to Moscow. Sorge had been a Soviet agent since 1929, and his cover was perfect. He was a member of the Nazi Party, respected by the German community in Japan, trusted with sensitive information about military plans and diplomatic strategies. In December 1940, Sorge sent his first warning to Moscow. German officials in Tokyo were talking about a massive military buildup on the Soviet border. Something big was being planned. Moscow filed the report and took no action. In Berlin, a network of anti-Nazi resistance fighters known to German counterintelligence as the Red Orchestra was gathering information from sources inside the German government itself. Harro Schulze-Boysen, a Luftwaffe officer assigned to the Air Ministry, had access to some of the most sensitive military planning documents in the Reich. His colleague Arvid Harnack worked in the Ministry of Economics. Together, they began transmitting detailed reports about Operation Barbarossa to Moscow. The attack would come in the spring. 3 army groups would advance simultaneously. Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, Army Group South toward Kiev, and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Over 3 million German soldiers would participate, supported by tanks, aircraft, and artillery on a scale never before seen. Moscow received these reports. Stalin read them personally. And he dismissed them as British provocations. You see, Stalin had convinced himself that the warnings about a German attack were part of an elaborate plot by Winston Churchill to drag the Soviet Union into the war against Germany. Britain was desperate, fighting alone against the Nazi juggernaut, and Churchill would say anything, do anything, to get the Soviets to join the fight. In Stalin's mind, the logic was simple. Germany was still fighting Britain. Hitler would never be stupid enough to open a two-front war, the same mistake that had doomed Germany in 1914. The reports of a coming attack must therefore be disinformation, designed to provoke Stalin into some aggressive action that would give Hitler an excuse to break the pact. This conviction, this absolute certainty that he understood Hitler better than anyone else, would prove catastrophic. As 1940 turned to 1941, the warnings began to multiply, and they came from every direction, from sources that had no connection to each other, all saying the same thing. On March 1st, 1941, Sumner Welles, the United States Undersecretary of State, summoned the Soviet ambassador to Washington and handed him a detailed report. American intelligence had learned of German plans to attack the Soviet Union. The attack would come in the spring, possibly as early as April. Stalin's response? He suspected the Americans were working with the British to spread disinformation. On March 20th, a Soviet spy in Berlin codenamed Starshina sent an urgent message. German military preparations were intensifying. Troops were moving east in massive numbers. The attack was imminent. Stalin scrawled a note on the report. Suspicious, to be listed with telegrams intended as provocations. On April 3rd, Winston Churchill personally sent a message to Stalin through the British ambassador in Moscow. British intelligence had intercepted German communications indicating that Hitler was planning to attack. Churchill urged Stalin to prepare. Stalin didn't even bother to respond. He told his advisors that Churchill was trying to trick him into starting a war with Germany. On May 12th, Richard Sorge sent his most urgent warning yet from Tokyo. He had learned from the German ambassador that 150 German divisions were now massed on the Soviet border. The attack would begin in late June, possibly around June 20th. The head of Soviet military intelligence, General Philipp Golikov, reviewed the report. Golikov was a survivor of Stalin's purges, and he had learned an important lesson. Give the boss what he wants to hear. He marked Sorge's report as doubtful intelligence from an unreliable source. But the warnings kept coming. They came from Soviet border guards who reported German reconnaissance planes flying deep into Soviet territory. They came from railway workers who tracked the movement of German troops and equipment toward the border. They came from diplomats in capitals across Europe who heard the same rumors, the same whispers of impending war. On May 30th, Sorge sent another message, this one containing a specific date. Berlin informed Ambassador Ott that the German attack will commence in the latter part of June, he reported. Ott is 95% certain that war will commence. Stalin read the report. He took a pen and wrote, "This is not from a reliable source, but from someone who has set up little brothels in Japan." Even as Hitler finalized his plans for the greatest military operation in history, Stalin refused to believe it was coming. On June 10th, Leopold Trepper, the mastermind behind the Red Orchestra spy network, sent his own warning from Paris. He had received information from sources inside the German military. The attack would begin on June 22nd. 3 army groups, 3 million soldiers, the largest invasion force ever assembled. Stalin dismissed this warning like all the others. What Stalin didn't know was that even his own military commanders were growing increasingly alarmed. General Ivan Tulinev, commander of the Moscow military district, later recalled the strange atmosphere in the weeks before the invasion. "Everyone could see the storm clouds gathering," he wrote. "Everyone except the one man who needed to see them most." On June 14th, just 8 days before the invasion, the Soviet news agency TASS issued an official statement that would become one of the most tragically ironic documents of the 20th century. The statement denied rumors of German military preparations near the Soviet border and declared that Germany was faithfully observing the terms of the Non-Aggression Pact. The statement had been personally approved by Stalin. That same day, as TASS was denying any German threat, German generals were receiving their final briefings for Operation Barbarossa. Army Group Center Commander Fedor von Bock noted in his diary that everything was ready. The greatest military force ever assembled was poised to strike. And then, on the night of June 21st, came the most desperate warning of all. His name was Alfred Liskow. He was a 30-year-old German soldier, a furniture maker from Kolberg who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht and assigned to Infantry Regiment 2922 of the 75th Infantry Division. Unlike most of his comrades, Liskow was a communist. He had been a member of the Red Front Fighters League before the Nazis came to power. He hated Hitler and everything he stood for. When Liskow's unit received orders to prepare for an attack on the Soviet Union, an attack scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock the next morning, he made a decision that would define his life. At 9 o'clock in the evening on June 21st, 1941, Alfred Liskow left his unit, walked to the Bug River that marked the border between German-occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, and jumped into the dark water. He swam across, surrendering to Soviet border guards on the other side. The guards brought him to the headquarters of the 90th Border Detachment. There was no German translator available, so they had to wait while a local German teacher was roused from bed. It was nearly midnight before Liskow could finally communicate his warning. The German army was going to attack at 4 o'clock in the morning. Thousands of tanks, millions of soldiers. The entire border would be hit simultaneously. There was no time to waste. The commander of the border detachment, Major M.S. Bichkovsky, immediately reported the warning up the chain of command. The report reached the commander of the Fifth Army, Major General M.I. Potapov. Potapov's response? He was suspicious of the report and took no action. The report continued up the chain of command, eventually reaching the Kremlin itself. Stalin was informed of the German deserters' warning. His response would become infamous. According to one account, Stalin ordered that the deserter be shot for spreading disinformation. According to another, he simply dismissed the warning as another provocation. What is certain is that no orders were given to prepare for an attack. No troops were moved to defensive positions. No air defenses were activated. At 3:15 in the morning on June 22nd, 1941, while Alfred Liskow was still being interrogated, German artillery opened fire along the entire 1,800-mile front. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The attack was devastating, beyond anything the Soviet command had imagined. The Luftwaffe struck first, launching waves of bombers and fighters against Soviet airfields. The Soviet Air Force was the largest in the world in 1941, with over 19,000 aircraft. But most of them were obsolete models, and worse, they were lined up in neat rows on their airfields, wingtip to wingtip, perfect targets for German bombs. In the first 24 hours, the Germans destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft on the ground. By the end of the first week, they had achieved total air superiority over the entire front. Soviet soldiers would fight the rest of the campaign under constant threat from the sky, with no protection from German bombers and no support from their own air force. On the ground, the German advance was even more spectacular. Panzer divisions raced across the border, bypassing Soviet strongpoints and driving deep into enemy territory. The speed of the advance was unprecedented, 50 miles a day in some sectors, faster than anyone had thought possible. Soviet units along the border were caught completely by surprise. Many were still in their peacetime barracks. Many had no ammunition, no fuel, no orders. Communication lines were cut within hours, leaving commanders with no idea what was happening on either side of them. The result was chaos. At Minsk, 200 miles behind the original border, German forces trapped an entire Soviet army group in a massive encirclement. 300,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in a matter of days. At Bialystok, another encirclement netted another 300,000 prisoners. The Germans were advancing so fast that they couldn't process all the prisoners they were taking. And through it all, one question haunted Soviet commanders at every level. How had this happened? How had they been caught so completely unprepared? The answer, of course, was Joseph Stalin. For nearly 8 hours after the invasion began, Stalin refused to believe what was happening. He convinced himself that the attack was a provocation by rogue German commanders, not a full-scale invasion authorized by Hitler. He ordered his troops not to respond, fearing that any Soviet action would give Hitler an excuse to escalate. This order was catastrophic. Soviet troops who could have fought back were ordered to stand down. Soviet aircraft that could have attacked German columns were grounded. Precious hours were lost while Stalin struggled to accept reality. When he finally accepted that the invasion was real, Stalin's response was equally disastrous. Rather than authorize a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions, he ordered his armies to counterattack immediately. The result was a series of hasty, uncoordinated offensives that accomplished nothing except to expose Soviet units to German firepower. By the end of June 22nd, the first day of the invasion, the Soviet military situation was already desperate. Entire divisions had been destroyed. Air bases across the Western Soviet Union had been reduced to smoking ruins. The Germans were advancing on multiple fronts with no effective opposition. But the worst was yet to come. In the weeks that followed, the disaster deepened. Army Group Center drove toward Moscow with terrifying speed. By mid-July, German forces had captured Smolensk, just 200 miles from the Soviet capital. It seemed like nothing could stop them. But Hitler made a fateful decision. Instead of pressing directly toward Moscow, he diverted forces south to complete the encirclement of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and one of the most important cities in the Soviet Union. The Kiev operation was a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe for the Soviets. By September 19th, German forces had trapped 4 complete Soviet armies in a pocket around the city. 665,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the largest encirclement in military history. Let me say that number again, 665,000 soldiers lost in a single battle. Stalin had been warned about the danger. His commanders had begged him to authorize a withdrawal before the encirclement was complete. He refused. He insisted that Kiev must be held at all costs. The cost was nearly 700,000 men. By October 1941, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. The Soviet Union had suffered over 4 million casualties, dead, wounded, or captured. 3 million Soviet soldiers were in German prisoner of war camps, where most of them would die of starvation, disease, or murder. The Germans had advanced over 600 miles into Soviet territory and occupied land that had been home to 40% of the Soviet population. All of this, every death, every defeat, every captured soldier, traced back to one man's refusal to listen. Stalin had received more than 80 separate warnings about the German invasion. They had come from his own spies, from foreign governments, from military intelligence, from border guards. They had named the date. They had described the scale. They had laid out the German plan in precise detail. He had ignored them all. Why? Historians have debated this question for decades. Some argue that Stalin suffered from a form of strategic blindness, convinced that his own analysis was superior to any intelligence report. Others suggest that he was paralyzed by fear, that acknowledging the German threat would mean admitting that his pact with Hitler had been a mistake. The most compelling explanation may be the simplest. Stalin had surrounded himself with yes-men and sycophants, people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The Great Purge had eliminated anyone willing to challenge the dictator's judgment. Those who remained had learned that disagreeing with Stalin was a death sentence. When intelligence chiefs received reports that contradicted Stalin's beliefs, they had 2 choices: present the truth and risk their lives, or suppress the truth and hope for the best. Most chose survival. General Philippe Golikov, the head of military intelligence, was particularly guilty of this. He routinely altered reports to match Stalin's expectations, dismissing accurate intelligence as disinformation and highlighting anything that supported Stalin's conviction that Germany would not attack. In a normal government, Golikov's behavior would have been criminal negligence. In Stalin's Soviet Union, it was the only rational response to an impossible situation. The irony is bitter. The Soviet intelligence apparatus was one of the most effective in history. The NKVD and GRU had agents in every major capital, in German military headquarters, in the very offices where Operation Barbarossa was planned. They knew everything. And none of it mattered, because the man at the top refused to listen. But the story of Operation Barbarossa is not only a story of disaster, It is also a story of survival and ultimately of redemption. In the darkest hours of the war, when German tanks were within sight of Moscow's spires, when it seemed like the Soviet Union might collapse entirely, something remarkable happened. The Soviet people refused to give up. Factory workers in Moscow and Leningrad worked 18-hour shifts producing weapons and ammunition, often under German bombardment. Peasants burned their own crops rather than let them fall into German hands. Partisans behind enemy lines sabotaged German supply lines, destroyed bridges, and assassinated collaborators. And in Siberia, far from the front lines, fresh divisions were training and equipping for the fight ahead. This brings us back to Richard Sorge, the spy whose warnings Stalin had dismissed so contemptuously. By September 1941, with Moscow under direct threat, Stalin finally began to pay attention to Sorge's reports, not about German intentions, but about Japanese ones. Stalin desperately needed to know whether Japan was planning to attack the Soviet Union from the east. If so, he could not afford to move his Siberian divisions west. If not, those divisions might save Moscow. Sorge delivered the answer. Through his contacts at the Japanese embassy in Tokyo, he learned that Japan had decided to move south, toward the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, rather than north against the Soviet Union. On September 14, 1941, he sent Moscow the most important message of his career. The possibility of Japan attacking the Soviet Union, which existed until recently, has disappeared. This time, Stalin listened. In October and November 1941, fresh Siberian divisions began arriving on the Moscow front. These were not ragged survivors of earlier battles, but well-trained, well-equipped soldiers, dressed in warm winter clothing and armed with modern weapons. They arrived just as the German advance ground to a halt, stopped by a combination of Soviet resistance, autumn mud, and the approaching winter. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive outside Moscow. The Siberian divisions, 15 infantry divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft transferred from the Far East, spearheaded the attack. The Germans, exhausted and freezing in summer uniforms because Hitler had not authorized winter equipment, were thrown back. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was in retreat. Hitler's army had suffered its first defeat. Richard Sorge never learned the impact of his final reports. On October 18, 1941, Japanese counterintelligence arrested him and his entire spy ring. He was tortured, interrogated, and eventually hanged at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo on November 7, 1944, the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. When the Japanese asked Moscow about Sorge, offering to exchange him for Japanese prisoners, the Soviet response was chilling. "We know of no one by that name." Stalin had abandoned the man who had saved Moscow, the man whose warnings he had ignored until it was almost too late. The war would continue for nearly 4 more years. The Soviet Union would suffer staggering losses, an estimated 27 million dead, more than any other nation in the conflict. The battle for Stalingrad, the siege of Leningrad, the grinding advance westward through 1943 and 1944, all of these lay ahead. But the fundamental pattern had been established in those first terrible months of Barbarossa. Stalin had ignored his intelligence services, with catastrophic results. When he finally began listening, the tide began to turn. What can we learn from this tragedy? The lesson is not simply that leaders should listen to their intelligence services. That much is obvious. The deeper lesson is about the nature of power and the dangers of surrounding oneself with people who are afraid to speak the truth. Stalin's purges had eliminated anyone who might challenge him. The survivors had learned that honesty was dangerous and sycophancy was safe. When the moment of crisis came, there was no one left who could break through Stalin's delusions. This pattern has repeated throughout history, from Hitler's bunker to Saddam Hussein's palaces to modern authoritarian regimes around the world. When leaders surround themselves with fear, they lose access to the truth. And without the truth, they cannot make good decisions. 4 million Soviet soldiers paid for Stalin's blindness in the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa. Millions more would die before the war was over. The vast majority of those deaths were preventable, not by perfect intelligence, but simply by a leader willing to listen to the warnings he received. Richard Sorge had given Stalin the exact date of the invasion. Leopold Trepper had laid out the German plan in detail. Alfred Liskow had risked everything, his career, his family, his life, to swim across a river and warn the Soviet command. None of it mattered. Because Joseph Stalin had already decided what he wanted to believe. And that decision would cost his country everything. The border near Brest-Litovsk, where we began this story, was one of the first places hit on June 22, 1941. The fortress there held out for nearly a month, its defenders fighting to the last man against overwhelming German forces. Their resistance became legendary, a symbol of Soviet courage in the face of impossible odds. But that resistance should never have been necessary. If Stalin had listened to his spies, if he had heeded the warnings, if he had prepared his forces for the attack that everyone except him knew was coming, the story of Operation Barbarossa might have been very different. Instead, it became the greatest catastrophe in Soviet history and one of the greatest intelligence failures of all time. Not because the intelligence was wrong, but because the man who needed to hear it had stopped listening. The echoes of that failure still resonate today, a reminder that the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world is useless if the people in power refuse to believe what it tells them. 4 million casualties in 6 months. That was the price of Stalin's certainty. That was the cost of not listening. And it is a lesson that the world cannot afford to forget. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of history's most tragic examples of intelligence failure. If you found this video valuable, please like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth historical analysis. Your support makes these videos possible. In the comments below, let me know, what historical what-ifs fascinate you the most? What other intelligence failures should we explore in future videos? Until next time, remember, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Character count, approximately 24,000 characters. But we must continue, for the story of Barbarossa's aftermath is equally compelling and equally illuminating about the nature of leadership in crisis. The winter of 1941 to 1942 brought a temporary reprieve. The Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back from Moscow, and for a brief moment it seemed like the tide might have turned. Stalin, emboldened by this success, made another catastrophic decision. He ordered offensives everywhere. Rather than consolidating the gains around Moscow and building up strength for future operations, Stalin demanded attacks across the entire front. He was convinced that the German army was on the verge of collapse, that one more push would send Hitler's forces streaming back toward Berlin. He was wrong. The spring of 1942 brought renewed German offensives. This time, Hitler focused his efforts on the south, driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus that Germany desperately needed. The target was a city on the Volga River, a city that bore Stalin's own name, Stalingrad. The battle that followed would become the bloodiest in human history. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet forces fought house to house, room to room, in the shattered ruins of the city. The casualties were staggering, nearly 2 million dead, wounded, or captured from both sides combined. But Stalingrad was different from the disasters of 1941 in one crucial way. This time, Stalin listened to his generals. The turning point came in November 1942, when General Georgy Zhukov presented Stalin with a daring plan. Rather than pouring more troops into the meat grinder of Stalingrad itself, the Soviets would launch massive counteroffensives on the flanks of the German advance, encircling the German Sixth Army in the city. In the summer of 1941, Stalin would have dismissed such a plan as defeatist. He would have demanded immediate frontal attacks. He would have insisted that not one step backward be taken. But 18 months of catastrophic defeats had finally taught him something. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive began. Within 4 days, the German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was surrounded. Hitler, displaying the same strategic blindness that Stalin had shown in 1941, refused to allow a breakout. He promised to supply the trapped army by air, a promise that proved impossible to keep. By February 2, 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist. 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Only about 5,000 would ever return home. Stalingrad was the turning point of the war. From that moment on, the German army was in retreat. The Soviets would suffer terrible losses in the 2.5 years of fighting that followed, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Hitler's gamble had failed. And Joseph Stalin, the man whose stubbornness had caused such catastrophe in 1941, had finally learned to trust his military commanders. It is one of history's bitter ironies that the same qualities that made Stalin such a disastrous leader in the early months of the war, his stubbornness, his paranoia, his refusal to accept defeat, also helped the Soviet Union survive. Stalin's insistence on fighting to the last man, on never surrendering territory without a struggle, may have been strategically foolish, but it bought time for the Soviet Union to mobilize its vast reserves of manpower and industrial capacity. The question that haunts historians is simple. How many lives could have been saved if Stalin had listened from the beginning? Consider the numbers. In the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union suffered over 4 million casualties. Many of these losses occurred in the massive encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, encirclements that happened because Soviet forces were not prepared for the attack and were not authorized to withdraw. If Stalin had heeded the warnings, if he had ordered his forces to defensive positions along more defensible lines, if he had authorized strategic withdrawals when encirclement threatened, Millions of those soldiers might have survived. They might have fought another day. They might have defended Moscow. They might have contributed to the counteroffensives that eventually drove the Germans back. Instead, they died in the killing grounds of the Western Soviet Union, victims not of German military superiority, but of their own leaders' refusal to face reality. The intelligence was there, the warnings were clear, the spies had done their job. Only the listener had failed. Let us return, one final time, to the men who tried so desperately to prevent this catastrophe. Richard Sorge died on the gallows in Tokyo, abandoned by the country he had served. For 20 years after the war, the Soviet Union refused to acknowledge his existence. It wasn't until 1964, long after Stalin's death, that Sorge was finally recognized as a hero of the Soviet Union. His face appeared on postage stamps. Streets were named after him. Monuments were erected to his memory. None of it could bring him back. Leopold Trepper, the conductor of the Red Orchestra, survived the war, barely. Arrested by the Gestapo in 1942, he managed to escape and spent the rest of the war in hiding with the French resistance. When the war ended, he returned to Moscow, expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, he was arrested and imprisoned in the Lubyanka, the notorious headquarters of Soviet state security. His crime? The Soviet leadership could not forgive him for being right when they had been wrong. The man who had warned of Barbarossa spent 10 years in prison, a living reminder of Stalin's greatest failure. He was released only after Stalin's death in 1953. He eventually emigrated to Israel, where he wrote his memoirs and spent his final years in Jerusalem. He died in 1982, still bitter about the treatment he had received from the system he had served so faithfully. Alfred Liskow, the German soldier who had swum across the Bug River to warn the Soviets, met perhaps the strangest fate of all. Initially, the Soviets used him for propaganda, holding him up as an example of German workers who opposed Hitler. His face appeared on leaflets dropped over German lines, urging soldiers to desert. But Liskow was too honest for his own good. He had become a communist because he believed in communist ideals, ideals that the Soviet Union had betrayed. When he met the leaders of the Communist International in Moscow, he was disgusted by their cynicism and corruption. He accused them of being Nazi sympathizers, of betraying the revolution. This was a serious mistake. In January 1942, Alfred Liskow was arrested by the NKVD on charges of fascism and anti-Semitism, charges so absurd they could only have come from a Stalinist show trial. He was sent to Siberia, where he disappeared from history. His exact fate is unknown, but he is believed to have died near Novosibirsk in late 1943. He had risked everything to save the Soviet Union from surprise attack. His reward was imprisonment and death. These men, Sorge, Trepper, Liskow, and dozens of others whose names are less well known, represent one of the great tragedies of intelligence history. They had the information that could have changed the course of the war. They risked their lives to deliver it, and they were betrayed not by enemy counterintelligence, but by the very leadership they were trying to protect. The fault did not lie with them. It lay with a system that punished honesty and rewarded sycophancy, a system that valued loyalty to the leader above loyalty to the truth. Joseph Stalin would go on to lead the Soviet Union through the rest of the war and beyond, dying in 1953 as one of the most powerful men in the world. His crimes, the purges, the famines, the gulags, would not be fully acknowledged until years after his death. Even today, in modern Russia, his legacy remains controversial. But among historians of intelligence, there is little debate about his greatest failure. In 1941, Joseph Stalin had access to one of the most extensive spy networks in history. He received detailed, accurate warnings about Operation Barbarossa from dozens of sources. He knew the date of the attack, the size of the invading force, the direction of the German advance. And he ignored it all. Because he had already decided what he wanted to believe. 4 million Soviet soldiers paid the price in 6 months. 27 million Soviet citizens would die before the war was over. And it all began because one man refused to listen. The survivors of those terrible first months, the soldiers who escaped the encirclements, the civilians who fled before the advancing Germans, the workers who dismantled factories and shipped them east piece by piece, they rebuilt the Soviet Union from the ashes of 1941. Their sacrifice and determination ultimately turned the tide of the war. But they should never have had to make that sacrifice. The warnings were there. The intelligence was clear. Only the listener had failed. And that failure cost the Soviet Union everything. Remember that. Remember the men who tried to warn. Remember the leader who refused to listen. Remember the 4 million who paid the price. And remember that the most sophisticated intelligence service in the world is worthless if the people in power refuse to believe what it tells them. That is the lesson of Operation Barbarossa. That is the cost of certainty. That is the price of not listening. 4 million casualties in 6 months. Let that number sink in. 4 million. In just 6 months. Because one man thought he knew better than everyone else. This has been the story of Stalin's greatest failure. It is a story of brilliant spies and cowardly sycophants. It is a story of courage ignored and truth suppressed. It is a story of the deadliest military operation in human history and the catastrophic decision that made it possible. The final toll of the Eastern Front staggers the imagination. By the time Soviet forces planted their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin in May 1945, the war had consumed 27 million Soviet lives, soldiers and civilians alike. To put that number in perspective, that is more than the combined populations of modern-day Norway, Denmark, and Finland. It is more than the total number of Americans who died in all wars in the nation's history, multiplied by 50. The German losses were equally devastating. Over 4 million German soldiers died on the Eastern Front, 80% of all German military deaths in World War II. The Eastern Front was where the war was won and lost. It was where Hitler's ambitions were finally crushed. But it never had to be this way. The tragedy of Operation Barbarossa is not simply that it happened. Wars happen. Military disasters happen. Throughout history, nations have been caught off guard by sudden attacks. The tragedy is that this particular disaster was entirely preventable. Joseph Stalin had every warning he could possibly have asked for. His intelligence services had penetrated the highest levels of the German government. His spies had obtained copies of the actual invasion plans. He knew the date, he knew the targets, he knew the force composition. He simply chose not to believe it. And in making that choice, he condemned millions of his own people to death. The psychological mechanism at work here has a name. Modern scholars call it confirmation bias, the tendency to accept information that confirms what we already believe and reject information that contradicts it. Stalin believed that Hitler would not attack. Therefore, any intelligence suggesting otherwise must be disinformation. But confirmation bias alone does not explain the scale of Stalin's failure. Other factors were at work. First was the atmosphere of terror that Stalin himself had created. The Great Purge of 1937-1938 had taught Soviet officials that disagreeing with Stalin was potentially fatal. When intelligence officers received reports that contradicted Stalin's beliefs, they faced an impossible choice: tell the truth and risk execution, or lie and hope for the best. Most chose to lie. General Philip Golikov, the head of military intelligence, was particularly skilled at telling Stalin what he wanted to hear. He routinely suppressed or altered reports that suggested a German attack was imminent. He classified accurate intelligence as disinformation and highlighted dubious reports that supported Stalin's preconceptions. After the war, Golikov was not punished for his failures. He prospered under Stalin's regime, eventually becoming a marshal of the Soviet Union. The man who had helped blind his nation to the greatest threat in its history died peacefully in 1980, covered in medals and honors. The second factor was Stalin's own personality. Like many dictators, Stalin combined enormous self-confidence with deep insecurity. He was convinced of his own genius, while simultaneously fearing that enemies surrounded him. This combination made him almost immune to advice that contradicted his judgments. When subordinates tried to warn him about the German buildup, Stalin interpreted their warnings as criticism of his diplomatic strategy, the non-aggression pact with Hitler that was supposed to keep the Soviet Union safe. Accepting their warnings would mean admitting that the pact had failed, that his grand strategy was flawed. Stalin's ego could not accept that possibility. The third factor was the nature of the Soviet system itself. In a democracy, even a flawed one, leaders face institutional checks on their power. Intelligence agencies report to multiple oversight bodies. Military commanders can raise concerns through official channels. The press can investigate and report on government failures. None of these checks existed in Stalin's Soviet Union. Power was concentrated in one man's hands to a degree almost unprecedented in modern history. When that man made a mistake, there was no mechanism to correct it. When that man refused to listen, there was no one who could make him hear. The result was the greatest intelligence failure in history, not because the intelligence failed, but because the political system had eliminated any possibility of speaking truth to power. These lessons resonate beyond the specific context of 1941. In every organization, whether a government, a corporation, or a military unit, leaders face the same temptation that consumed Stalin. It is easier to hear what we want to hear. It is comfortable to surround ourselves with people who agree with us. It is threatening to receive information that challenges our assumptions. But the cost of that comfort can be catastrophic. The best leaders actively seek out dissenting views. They reward honesty, even when the news is bad. They create cultures where subordinates feel safe delivering unwelcome truths. They understand that their own judgment, however good, is not infallible. Stalin did none of these things. And 4 million people paid the price in 6 months? Let me tell you one more story before we close. In the years after the war, Soviet veterans would sometimes gather to remember the comrades they had lost. At one such gathering in the 1960s, an aging general stood up to speak. He had been a young lieutenant in June 1941, stationed at a border post near Brest-Litovsk. He described the morning the invasion began, the shells falling, the tanks advancing, the chaos and terror of those first hours. He described watching his friends die, one after another, in a battle they had not been prepared to fight. And then he said something that silenced the room. "We knew," he said. "Everyone knew. The soldiers talked about it. We could see the German preparations across the river. We knew the attack was coming. We begged our commanders to let us prepare. They told us it was forbidden. They told us it would provoke the Germans." He paused, his voice breaking. "We were not surprised by the attack," he said. "We were surprised that we had been forbidden to defend ourselves. That is the true tragedy of Operation Barbarossa. The soldiers knew, the intelligence officers knew, the spies knew, everyone knew. Only Stalin refused to believe. And his refusal to believe killed millions. The siege of Leningrad alone claimed over 1 million lives, most of them civilians, who starved to death while German and Finnish forces surrounded the city for 872 days. The defenders ate rats, leather, wallpaper paste, anything that might keep them alive another day. Children grew up not knowing what bread looked like. Parents buried their children in the frozen ground, too weak to dig proper graves. All of this suffering, all of this death, all of it traceable to that one decision in June 1941. The decision to ignore every warning, to dismiss every report, to believe only what the dictator wanted to believe. The Soviet victory over Nazi Germany was one of history's great achievements. The courage, sacrifice, and determination of the Soviet people in the face of annihilation inspired the world and ultimately saved civilization from Hitler's barbarism. But that victory came at a cost that defies comprehension. And much of that cost was unnecessary. If Stalin had listened, if he had prepared, if he had allowed his commanders to deploy their forces properly, the war might still have happened. The fighting might still have been brutal. But the scale of the catastrophe, the 4 million casualties in 6 months, the encirclement of entire army groups, the near collapse of the Soviet state, none of that was inevitable. It was the result of one man's stubbornness. One man's refusal to hear what he did not want to believe. So remember this story. Remember it when you are tempted to dismiss information that contradicts your beliefs. Remember it when you are surrounded by people who only tell you what you want to hear. Remember it when you think you know better than everyone else. The most dangerous words in any language are, "I already know." Because sometimes what you know is wrong. And sometimes the cost of being wrong is everything. 4 million casualties in 6 months. That was the price of Stalin's certainty. That was the cost of not listening. And it is a lesson that the world cannot afford to forget. If you've made it this far, thank you for your attention. History's lessons are not always comfortable, but they are always necessary. The story of Barbarossa reminds us that even the most powerful leaders can be wrong, and that the cost of their mistakes is paid not by them, but by the millions who follow their orders. Subscribe to the channel for more historical deep dives. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And remember, the past is never really past. Its echoes shape our present and our future. Until next time.